The Imperator Aleksandr III was a Russian dreadnought built for the Imperial Russian Navy in the 1910s, and more specifically, the Black Sea Fleet. The dreadnoughts of the class followed along similar lines to their larger Baltic cousins, the Gangut or Sevastopol class. There were differences between the two, notably their size and length. The Emperor Alexander III, apologies for butchering the Russian name, was armed with 12 305mm or 12-inch 52 caliber guns in triple turrets along the centerline of the ship, and with a top speed of 21 knots, she was certainly a match for any ship in the Black Sea. She was completed and ran trials in mid-July 1917, when she was renamed to Liberty to match the new sense of liberty in the nation. Still, it wasn't exactly a time of stability in Russia, and several months later, in April 1918, she was forced to flee to Novorossiysk to escape the German advance, but to no avail, as the Germans took control of the ship on June 19th and even cruised under a German flag, with some claiming the ship was renamed Volga. In November 1918, she was handed over to the Anglo-French forces and then over to White Russian forces, who used her in the Black Sea, renaming her General Alekseev. After helping to evacuate White Russian forces from Sevastopol, she was interned by French authorities on December 29, 1920, and through the coming years, possible suitors came to buy the ship, namely the Soviets. However, it was never right, and she was sold for scrap in the late 1920s. In January 1910, there were reports from the Russian naval attachés in London and Constantinople that reported the Ottoman Empire was ordering dreadnoughts from the United Kingdom, this being the Reshidia or the eventual HMS Aran and a possible sister ship. Although these rumors and reports from the attachés were premature, the threat of a rearming Ottoman Empire to Russia was something that was intolerable to the Russian people and government. Although the Naval Ministry had no intentions of building new battleships for the Black Sea Fleet, there was nothing the Naval Ministry could do to change the people's minds or the government's, and essentially, against their will, they were forced to look into designs for the Black Sea dreadnought battleships. The Naval General Staff proposed a set of characteristics, the first being speed. Speed was not as important as compared to the Sevastopol class because these new ships were confined to the Black Sea. A top speed of 20.5 or 21 knots instead of 23 was perfectly fine. It meant they could devote more time and resources to heavier guns or armor. Turret armor was increased to 250mm from the 200 on the Sevastopol class, and the elevation of the guns was increased by 5 degrees. Different turret configurations were considered. However, the Naval General Staff decided they liked the unique linear arrangement of the turrets, with all of them remaining on the centerline at the same level. There were improvements to the turrets, making them roomier for the crews, and it should be noted that when the British had the ex-Emperor Alexander III in 1919, they were extremely interested in the turrets, as they wanted to use the triple turrets on capital ships. The secondary battery was increased from 102mm to 130mm, or from 4 inches to 5.1 inches in casemates on either side of the ship, due to the increasing size of destroyers. With these rough estimates, the design was handed over to the Duma or Parliament for approval. The 102 million ruble bill was approved and then signed into law in May 1910, which authorized the construction of 3 battleships, 9 destroyers, and 6 submarines for the Black Sea Fleet. Since we haven't discussed Russian ships all too much on the channel, something important to understand is that in Russia, especially in the imperial past, the design and construction phase gets a little weird. I mean, look at these circular monitors from the 1870s. And even between different ships of the same class, there can be some serious differences between them, because different decisions were made between the dockyards and the naval staff. In this case, the first radical and unique idea was from the chief inspector of shipbuilding, who thought that they should replace the machinery with diesels, a very forward-thinking idea. It was estimated that they would save 3,000 tons and allow 14-inch guns to be used on the battleships. The idea was eventually rejected as it was not practical, and debates continued at a somewhat leisurely pace. Remember, the Navy didn't want to do this anyway. In May 1911, before the bill approving the ships was signed, news about the Ottomans actually ordering the 2 dreadnoughts from British yards, armed with 13.5-inch guns, broke, and now it was finally time to panic. The Russians again got the date wrong, and the Ottomans did not order the ships until June, but still, they were being ordered, at least one of the proposed two. Nevertheless, the naval ministry got kicked into gear as they feared the Ottomans would launch a preemptive strike as soon as their dreadnoughts were complete. The Ottoman ships were not just dreadnoughts, but super-dreadnoughts, meaning they were larger and more powerfully armed than the first-generation dreadnoughts the Russians were building, so they began looking into upgunning the Empress Maria class. The Artillery Commission found that the difficulties of obtaining this armament, i.e. 14-inch guns, lay in the fact that the Obukovsky work is not in the position to provide the necessary number of 14-inch guns, 36 barrels, by the deadline stipulated by the MGSH for the completion of these vessels, the 1st of January 1915, and this will delay the completion of the vessels by 1.5 years. They then looked into purchasing guns from abroad, Armstrong, Vickers, Coventry, Klopp, Skoda, and Schneider, but the Naval General Staff concluded that the 12-inch guns of the class were more than sufficient to handle the 13.5-inch guns the Ottoman battleships carried. After some thought about transferring the Sevastopol class from the Baltic to the Black Sea and understanding its impracticality, the final design was set at 12-inch guns and a 21-knot top speed. Russian shipyards in the south of the country were chosen because few foreign firms wanted to take on the Russian ships. Many of the southern shipbuilding companies lacked experience and therefore relied on help from domestic and foreign shipbuilders like the Baltic shipbuilders and the British firm Vickers. Now, from reading up on Russian ship construction and the Navy as a whole, one gets the impression that the shipbuilding firms, naval staff, and the different fleets didn't get along too well. So in this competition, the first contract went to the Society of Nikolaev Works and Yards, or the Russian abbreviation ONZIV. In the new company, the Russian Shipbuilding Joint Stock Company, or RUSID, got the other contracts. The competition was pretty fierce from the different shipbuilders. Still, the new RUSID got the backing and financial support of the Imperial family, and so got the second bid along with help from the designers of the state-owned Baltic Works. These two were given preliminary orders in late August 1911. Once this was done, the two firms began working hard to complete designs, and throughout the autumn and winter of 1911, they competed with one another to get their ideas chosen. Unsurprisingly, the state-backed, more experienced RUSID/Baltic Works design won the competition, and the ships began being laid down in October 1911. There were provisions in the contracts for the 3 battleships to be made out of exclusively Russian material and equipment. This was quite ambitious, and so there was an escape clause to allow the firms building the ships to use outside help. RUSID used equipment from the British firm John Brown for some of the machinery. ONZIV used Vickers. Emperor Aleksandr III was built in Rusod dockyards, and it was required that she and her sister Empress Maria be completed by August 1915. She was launched in April 1914 and entered service in June 1917. Due to being built in Rusod, she was very similar to Empress Maria with a few minor changes. Here are the particulars. I'll leave it up so you can pause and take a look if you'd like. Although the Empress Maria and Catherine the Great were completed rather quickly, considering the situation, Alexander III, on the other hand, got the short end of the stick when it came to the building program. Although she was built to the same design as Empress Maria, her completion had to be delayed due to the outbreak of war, and so that resources could be concentrated on her sisters, and so they could be completed quickly. Before she was completed in the summer of 1917, she was renamed Liberty to match the changing situation in Russia with the February Revolution, which most naval officers were rolling with, not going to dig too much into that. Another important thing that happened before she entered service was the catastrophic destruction of Empress Maria in Sevastopol, most likely due to a cordite fire. I think it's important to go over the destruction of the ship so you can get a sense of what we're dealing with. To quote from Russian and Soviet battleships by Stephen McLaughlin, at 6:20 a.m. on October 20th, 1916, a sailor passing by the forward turret heard a hissing sound. Within seconds, smoke and flames began issuing from hatches and ventilators near the turret and embrasures of the turret itself. The alarm was sounded and fire hoses were unreeled, but before anything more could be done, the ship suffered a powerful explosion. Flames were observed shooting almost 1,000 feet into the air. The conning tower, foremast, and forefunnel were all blown over the side, and the forward turret was displaced. Perhaps as many as 100 men were killed or wounded by the blast. Through the shattered upper decks, fires could be seen raging below. A brave group of sailors led by the engineer-mechanic managed to flood the forward magazine, and sadly all were lost, probably saving the ship from further catastrophic explosions. Further flooding of other magazines was ordered as a precaution. A string of smaller explosions continued after the first larger one. Just as the reeling crew thought they had the situation under control, at about 7 a.m., the ship was rocked by another explosion, almost as powerful as the first, destroying portions of the underwater hull. The ship began taking on water rapidly, with most of the forward bulkheads destroyed. It was impossible to stop the flooding. By 7:12, the stem post was submerged, and the ship was taking on a definite list to starboard. Within 4 minutes, as water poured in, the ship fully capsized at 7:16. Another 4 minutes passed, and by 7:20, the ship was fully underwater, taking 227 men down with her. Within an hour, the Russian Black Sea Fleet had lost one of its most powerful battleships due to an internal explosion. Link in the description for the full video of that. A terrible loss of life. Now the Black Sea Fleet was down only to one dreadnought to face off against the former German battlecruiser Goeben, albeit in not the best condition. Still a potent threat though. The loss of the battleship, although tragic, was not debilitating, as Liberty would soon be entering service in July 1917. In the meantime, the war was not developing in Russia's favor on land. The Black Sea Fleet, although more active than their Baltic cousins, was not doing a whole lot between July 1917 and the spring of 1918, with Admiral Kolchak able to maintain good relations with the new political assemblies even after the February Revolution, with the renaming of certain vessels like the now Liberty. However, things started to break down when agitators came down from the Baltic Fleet. By May 1917, things weren't looking good, with Kolchak resigning his post, and with that, no further battleship operations in 1917, along with another revolution in October. Taking from McLaughlin, the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on March 3, 1918, did not stem the German advance in the south. On the 13th of March, Odessa was occupied, and Nikolaev followed on the 17th. Day by day, the Germans were drawing closer to the dreadnoughts Vojvodina, Russia, and Liberty. Opinion was divided among the fleet sailors. In addition to the revolutionary movement, there were also strong currents of Ukrainian nationalism running through many of the ship's crews. The fleet commander, Rear Admiral M.P. Sablin, finally managed to convince all the ships that were mobile to flee from the advancing Germans. On the night of May 14th, the German vanguard began entering the city. The fleet put to sea, headed for Novorossiysk on the Caucasian coast. However, the Germans did acquire all the laid-up pre-dreadnoughts, as well as the incomplete democracy. The Germans demanded that the new people in charge, the Bolsheviks, get all the ships in Novorossiysk to return to Sevastopol. Lenin was loath to hand the ships over, so he worked out a ruse where Captain First Rank Tikhomenev of the Liberty would scuttle the ships if he received the signal from Moscow to surrender to the Germans. In this way, Lenin could claim that he tried to comply with the German demands, but the people on the scene had taken action and scuttled the ships. However, Lenin miscalculated the mood of the sailors on the scene. Some were willing to return to Sevastopol, so the fleet split. Some of them scuttled themselves in Novorossiysk, including the other dreadnought. Now the Black Sea Fleet was left to the Liberty and several other ships that returned to Sevastopol under the command of Tikhomenev's command. Their decision to return may have been based on forming a Ukrainian fleet with German support. It seems a majority of the men who returned were Ukrainian. However, the Germans had far more ambitious plans for the remnants of the Black Sea Fleet, with General Ludendorff planning to turn the sea into a German lake. Plans were therefore formed for the Liberty to be pressed into service, not for the Ukrainians, but for themselves, with a German crew. There were also hopes to use the laid-up pre-dreadnoughts as floating batteries at the Dardanelles. Crews were scraped together, and October 1st, 1918, the Germans took on the Liberty, with some claiming that she was renamed a Volga, but according to McLaughlin, this was incorrect. The Germans had little time to make the ship a viable option for operations, only having a full complement by October 15th. Although she made several cruises, her guns were still inoperable, something that had gone back to her time in Russian service. With the Armistice in November 1918, the battleship was handed over to the British in November, who were keen to take a peek at the triple turret arrangement. something they were eyeing for future battleship/battlecruiser projects, something you can learn about in my video on 18-inch monitors. Anyway, the dreadnought was handed over to the British on the 24th of November 1918, where a party from the light cruiser Canterbury took charge of her, where she was taken to Izmit in the Sea of Marmara, with a skeleton crew from the battleship Agamemnon taking over. In June 1919, the Bolsheviks were kicked out of Crimea, so it was thought safe to bring the battleship back to the area. This time, the crew was a party from HMS Iron Duke, and was handed over to General Wrangel's White Russian regime. She was renamed General Alekseev after one of the other White Russian leaders. The ship was used little by the Whites, and the British observers aboard reported that she was poorly officered and in bad condition. Wrangel's naval command seems to have had hopes of using some of the pre-dreadnoughts as floating batteries. However, things weren't going the best, so it never came about. By late 1920, things really weren't going well for Wrangel's regime, and by November 14th, they left Sevastopol. Wrangel and around 150,000 of his closest associates. Included in this was, of course, General Alekseev and other naval units like this famous pre-dreadnought, which were given asylum at the French North African port of Bizerta, where they remained for many years. The ships just sat there in Bizerta in somewhat good condition, unwanted by most world powers due to her being foreign and, let's be real, a first-generation dreadnought. Where to take from McLaughlin when the Soviets were in charge of Russia? For a while, the most promising prospect was the recovery of the ships that had been evacuated with General Wrangel's White Russian forces from Crimea in November 1920. These had been interned at Bizerta in French Algeria. The most valuable ship there was the General Alekseev. In June 1924, the new left-leaning French premier, Édouard Herriot, suggested to a Soviet diplomat that France might be willing to grant the Soviet Union diplomatic recognition and return the ships at Bizerta. In return, the Soviets would have to make good on pre-war Russian government bonds. It was a promising development for the Soviets. Although the Soviets had cancelled pre-war bonds and were opposed to any further discussion of that issue, they were willing to look at various methods to pay off pre-war bonds, including substituting it for raw materials like oil. With the return of the ships at Bizerta a possibility in July 1924, M.V. Fruns, the Red Army's chief of staff, proposed that she should be added back to the Black Sea Fleet. In December, a commission inspected the ship and found her in satisfactory condition, and some plans were considered for modernizing her in 1925. But negotiations over the debt carried on, and in April 1925, as the talks continued, the French premier's government collapsed, and in the next 14 months, no less than 6 governments took power. As far as the French were concerned, the Soviet debt and ships in Bizerta took a backseat to internal politics. When things cooled down in mid-1926, the new government showed far less interest in making a deal with the Soviets, and the matter of the ships in Bizerta was dropped quietly. The French Senate ultimately voted against returning the ships, and the dreadnought was sold to be scrapped in 1928. But not right away, and in 1931 she was sunk at her moorings, being raised and then scrapped, which was completed by 1936. Now, you can read some things online about her guns being sold to the Finns during the Winter War, and then them being captured by the Germans. I can't attest to the validity of that, because I only have online sources, but I figured I'd throw it in at the end to see if someone could come up with some reliable sources. In any case, thank you all for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.